Okay, there we go. It should be recording.
Okay.
Should we start with introductions?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I'm Jesse. I go to Central, obviously, and I live here in Ellensburg. So.
I'm Nasa. I go as well, but I live in Yakima, so I commute.
I'm Selena. Oh, go ahead.
I'm Olivia. Obviously, I go to Central too, and I live in Wapato, so I go sometimes to campus and sometimes I'm online.
I'm Selena. I live in Seattle, and I'm fully online. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, if we want to just dive right in, I do have a couple, just areas where we can just start doing the discussion. So for chapter 1, I was thinking we could just talk about maybe the religion and power that it talks about. If anyone wants to get that started.
Yeah, if I kind of something that interested me. It has a little bit to do with religion and power, but not a whole lot. But just kind of like the Mexica, like essentially they accepted the fact that they were wanderers for hundreds of years. You know, like even here in the United States, like a bunch of Europeans came and conquered the North and South America. But then there's like that idea of manifest destiny of like it was meant to happen. You know, like we were always supposed to be here. But in the Mexica worldview, they were kind of more like, oh, we were wanderers. We were getting beat up all the time, and then we got lucky and we took advantage of opportunities, and now we're at the top, which is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's something I found interesting about when it was talking about, their time being nomadic, was, it broke down the roles of men and women. And it mentioned, that they had a hunter-gatherer society and men being the hunters while women being the gatherers. Um, and women actually making these discoveries about the berries and being able to plant the seeds, and how that, they came up with the ideas, the men implemented the ideas, and then their society begins to flourish. It's interesting to just see that, working together between both men and women.
Yeah, like to just build off that a little, I thought the chapter really just highlighted the framework of everything and how, like what they lived by, their, grounding in religious rituals and the complex calendar system, all those aspects like made everything, like it set it up to make sense for me because, you read about it and you see it and it comes together really well once like chapters are able to highlight it.
That's how I felt with chapter 1. I felt like she set a good ground to build on. So like it going into explaining things, and especially with the appendix, it helped a lot. One of the things that I took notes of from chapter 1 was on page 29, how it was described how kind of like the women, if they were conquered, they would sacrifice them. And I thought that was interesting because we really don't know a lot about that type of history. So I thought that was interesting from chapter 1.
Kind of going off of what Olivia said about gender roles as well. Just kind of the first few pages of the book, even talking about Shieldflower, who's kind of like the martyr. I think that was kind of interesting as well because she was like, he talks about it afterwards. He said, or the author, sorry, she says, we're not even sure if she was 100% real. Yeah. We just know that she is like this martyr. The Mexica looked to her as like this great woman, this great idol, or like a person who represented the Mexica resilience. Like their ability to come back, which I thought was interesting because, like you said, there were specific roles for men and women in the society, and it mentions it later on as well that women were not seen as inferior, but it's interesting to see a woman as like a person of not worship, but reverence, I guess is the right word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noted a quote from page 32 that said, Shieldflower had to die as all do, knowing only that to posterity the fates would undoubtedly deal both blessings and trauma. She had to die as all do, hoping that those who came after her would demonstrate the same determination to be strong that she herself had shown. Um, that that stood out to me because even in that, even with the tragedy that she's experiencing, um, she's still thinking about having to be strong for her people and also just hoping that other people will, use her as an example and motivation. Um, and it's just interesting to see, a story in a society where women have strong roles compared to, when you hear, um, stories told from a European perspective.
Yeah, I really thought that that was an important aspect of it, and, I can appreciate that, I don't know, the storytelling of the chapter really just the highlighting of women and their roles, I think is just important to their worldview also. It makes a foundation for how the rest of everything, comes together, like their, worldview on the fifth son prophecy and everything kinda just it's a ladder, and I think, that being the foundation is really important.
I think overall it like the way she described it also, and it goes throughout the whole book. I feel like women were very much important
Mhm.
during this and not just cast aside to be wives, but they all like everybody has said they had a role and it was important. And I think that is highlighted not just in the first chapter, but throughout the book.
Yeah, it's
So,
it's, gone over a couple times, and I
mhm,
I think I like that it reverted back to it and not just left it as "Oh, we're just gonna talk about it once," 'cause
right.
I think it is a big part of the whole story and understanding it, so, um and I mean, once again, it was important then just to and for it to be talked about throughout these books is allows us to understand it better, so,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, it's mentioned as well in chapter 3 that in those like giant markets that they had, that there were women placed in position of power or authority, I should say, and they had control over like organizing these markets and everything, which is it's an interesting contrast, I guess, because rather than uh, superior and inferior, it's like two separate ones, but they mutually respect each other, like the positions of men and women, which is an interesting, obviously very different from the Western like idea of gender roles.
Mhm.
Yeah, and for women, you see this throughout all four of the chapters. Women have obviously they have the um, household duties, but even more so they have this obligation and this duty to produce children of importance. And you see that throughout the chapters, um, women talking about, women grieving, um, not being able to have children who will go on to do something important. And that just seems to be a major, um, not just duty for women in the eyes of Mashika men, but just for women viewing, like, that really has to do with how they view themselves. Um, their ability to produce an heir to the throne, or someone who will go on to become a priest or a warrior, or even a merchant rather than a burden bearer.
Mhm.
Sorry, not to change the subject randomly, but sorry, something that also interested me in the first chapter is kind of the introduction of the Nahua like ethno-linguistic group. So in school the Aztec, they used to be nomads, and then they saw like the eagle land on the cactus with a snake, and boom, Aztecs. Like that was kind of the narrative that I heard. But it was interesting to learn that there was an entire, like I said, ethno-linguistic group of people that migrated from the north, and they made up like many of these kingdoms and principalities that like ruled over Central America and Mexico. And so I thought that was kind of interesting that I didn't know that like an entire group of people came and settled Mexico, and they became the rulers essentially.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, and it kind of just builds off of the way like understanding these things is hard and easy at the same time because you can relate them back to things you've been taught in high school or things that you've been taught just about like settling in America, and it's a lot different and it's a lot more complex, and learning it in this setting is a lot different. So I appreciate that, like the back and forth, because you can try to relate it to one, but nothing is the same. One or the like. Um, and I also thought that was very interesting, and how the complexity of the story. It's kind of endless. I feel like every time you read any part of it, you have to like reconnect it to something, and then it's just. I think it's just like really cool, like understanding it all.
I know, like for me personally, because I'm Spanish and Mexican, it's kind of good to know like this history. And
Mhm.
so reading it, it's like, it's a little eye opening for me a bit, because you're not really taught a lot in school about this type of history. And so becoming more knowledgeable in this area, I think is in general, it's really important. And so in the first chapter, just learning like the little things, how she describes things, is very kind of like eye-opening a bit, I think. So
Yeah. No, I kind of connecting with that as well. It's interesting to see some connections, and it kind of makes me wonder because I lived in South America for a while, and then my wife is also from Honduras, and so I have some experience with Latino culture, and like family is, I feel, much more important than here in the United States. There's a much greater emphasis on it, and and it talks about that in the book. And so I wonder if that comes from kind of like the traditional Catholic Spanish traditions, or if it comes from this, not just Mexica, but like this culture, this where family is so important. So I'm curious as to where that custom comes from.
I feel like from like what I've been told is very deeply rooted in our culture. The family is really important. And so if you've been reading how they treated the women and stuff like that, you kind of see that like growing up, how women are treated in families, how they're treated more of the patriarch of the family. And I think that's just kind of just how it was taught to everybody and how we are raised is to always respect the elder woman in the family. And so I think that's what it really stems from for us anyway.
Yeah, and I think that goes kind of off of like how we're talking about women in society, women in culture, and this, like, especially throughout the book, and how important it is, like, not just how women see themselves, but how their society and culture does. Like, the community that you are in and how it thrives is based off of, things that are, deeper than politics, deeper than like things that like religion, because a lot of those have big aspects of it, but it's more just the humanity and morality of people that changes the ways cultures are.
So, kind of, since we're on the topic of family, what what were you guys' thoughts on um, the third and the fourth chapters talk a lot about polygamy, and kind of the benefits to it and the issues that it brings to the Mexica people. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I think I feel like it made sense then. Obviously, I don't think it makes that much sense anymore. But then I feel like for them and during that time, I feel like it made sense to be able to have more than one wife and create a larger family. I think that was something that was important then. Versus now, obviously, it's greatly shunned and you don't see it often unless it's in a certain religion. But I don't necessarily think it's as necessary as it was back then.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, marriages for like love are like not even 200 years old. Like that tradition is just brand new. And so for thousands of years, almost universally, I'm sure there were some other cultures that had something similar, but it was almost always for advantage or for gain. You know, it was political or economic. And so it makes sense, you know, for a king, like someone's a king or a lord or from a rich family, you know, people from lower social families are going to want to give their daughter to this person because then they have a connection to this high person. And so it makes sense in the thought process of the time of like, oh, we can advance socially, economically, then we can, you know, set up our daughter with this rich person. So
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, you know, reproduction was like the foundation of building a society that was, you know, new and fresh, and understanding that, you know, marriage wasn't always, you know, it's not, it wasn't sacred. Like, it's not like a ritual. It's not like something that can't be, you know, overlooked, because I feel like, you know, a lot of the times other parts of culture has nothing to do with marriage. And, you know, as many wives as you had with however many kids, it didn't really matter then. And I mean, yeah, it doesn't make sense now, but um I it fits in the story. I think how it should.
Yeah, and well, I think from a modern perspective, we don't really think about the possible benefits and, there being a purpose to practicing polygyny. Because for the Mexica, it was an almost foolproof way of ensuring that you have an heir. Because we see, um, from European monarchies, that's a big issue. But for the Mexica, if you have several wives, then you are guaranteed to have an heir. Now, as we see, that causes some issues later on, um, for the Mexica, and causes you know warfare to occur. But for them, it was a strategy of ensuring that you have someone to continue on the legacy.
I think something to remember as well that there were a couple of kinks, I guess you could say, with the Mexica and the practice of polygamy, but their kind of management of like the dual family rule, so it would pass from one family to the other, balance that much better than the other um, city states. I can't remember the name of the Altepets, I think is what they were called. But like there were other Altepets that collapsed because as soon as one ruler died, his 16 sons started fighting. But in the Mexica, there were a couple of times where there was some contention, but they were able to maintain stability, even though there was this high chance of instability just because of the number of male heirs that could potentially fight for power. So, and they used that to their advantage on a couple of occasions, if I remember correctly. There were some wars, and then they joined in on one side and helped them take power, essentially as a like a client state.
Yeah, you have probably gonna butcher this, but Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco. Um, on page 70, it said that in 1472, he joined with other leaders, but it mentions that there's an account of him having 60 sons and 57 daughters. Um, and on one hand, it's like, well, you have plenty of people to plenty of contenders for the throne, but also, you've got all of these brothers who want control. But something I thought was interesting is that on that same page, it mentions um, the Spaniards saying, basically thinking that the child who ended up becoming the heir, um, saying that, oh, that must have happened because his wife could only produce, one son, um, and they were completely um, ignorant to the idea that in Mexica society you could have more than one wife. Um, so it's just um, ironic that they, assumed that it was a matter of not being able to produce an heir when really it was a matter of producing too many heirs.
One thing I also found interesting was on chapter. Hold on, let's see. Oh, it was chapter 2. I don't know if it kind of relates to why they had a lot of wives, but maybe I thought was interesting was how the children of women that were enslaved were not going to be enslaved also. And I wonder, was it because they needed perhaps to have an heir, or they needed them for some other purpose that kind of relates to having an heir? I thought that was interesting.
I also found that interesting. I remember when I read over it, it was kind of just like how different it is to hear it, because it's just not normal. Like, as far as you reading it and all the other cultures that you see, was it because you know that's more their son, so it's the heir is. I just found it like confusing almost, because it just made sense. It was like, okay, so if they weren't going to be enslaved, so what happens to their mother now, kind of? And then it's like, does she stay to raise, be one of the wives, or does she could, that part only confused me, because I just felt like we're trying to relate that back to different things. It's like it didn't make sense if you already had so many other kids, so many other heirs. Um, so I thought that was also, yeah, I found that weird, confusing, interesting.
If I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, I would have to go back and double check. I didn't take a note on that part, but if I believe it mentioned that one of the reasons that they did it was to avoid like war or kind of like a revolt.
Yeah,
so like
yeah.
their children would be regular citizens, quote unquote, so that they wouldn't, revolt and take power themselves.
True. Okay, yeah.
Makes sense.
I would have to double check that though. I feel like I remember reading that, but
No, I think you may be right. I remember when I was reading over it, I was like, this section is not making the most sense to me, just because I don't know. Sometimes those kinds of parts confuse me, because I feel like it makes sense then, and now I see it in a more modern view. So it's like, doesn't really make sense. Did it really? But yeah, I think you're right. I think I did maybe see that too.
kind of as well something that is interesting to me, that is addressed mostly in chapters 2 and 3. But I also study anthropology, and so we do a lot of work with the Native American tribes here in the United States. And one of like the kind of like battles that's going on right now is kind of like this historical narrative of originally when the Europeans came, they were just savages, and then after a while, people tried to change that narrative, and then they changed it to noble savages, is what it's called. And so like these people that weren't as intelligent or civilized as Europeans, but they weren't like these barbarians like the Europeans said they were. And so now this battle is to present them as they really were, you know. And the author does a great job of that. I think he shows this. He shows kind of like just like in any other part of the world, there were like leaders who were politically savvy. You know, there were leaders who were deceptive, who they ruled and they conquered and they played politics just like in any other or in any other part of the world, which I think the author did a good job of portraying that.
Yeah, and the author, she mentions that, for a lot of chiefs, it wasn't. I think we kind of have this misconception of, the Mexica um, constantly at war with each other, being violent and brutal towards one another. But, the author mentions that going to battle was a serious decision to make, and it was something that a good chief would try to avoid if he knew that he was likely to lose those battles. Um, you know, because a good chief was a responsible chief. Um, and, with Mexica society, it's very community centered. And so sometimes you're doing things for the benefit of yourself, but more often you're doing things for the benefit of the entire population. And so, to go to battle knowing that you're going to lose would just be foolish, because you're going to, it's going to result in people dying and um, you losing power, and therefore um, your kingdom losing power.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that is King Itzcoatl, who was he was like the son of a relatively minor wife, and so he essentially had no like future to rule. And then the opportunity came, and he used warfare and kind of pushing political buttons in a very strategic way. And so I think he that culture, not culture, but that idea or like that manner of ruling kind of stuck with the future Mexica rulers. And so they would go out and fight and but they would do it in a strategic way that allowed them to maintain power without overstretching themselves, essentially.
Yeah, oh, you go ahead.
I was going to mention, the Triple Alliance that they formed,
Mhm.
when he was in power, um, you can see it come in handy later on in, future endeavors of future rulers.
Mm. And I would say that a big part of, the decisions that are made, there's also like this, like the author highlights the fragility of the decisions that they make and how, you know, there's different things that go into them, whether that be their beliefs and, how different rulers felt about war and felt about putting their societies into it. I think, like the power and the gain of power was played obviously the biggest role, but at the same time, it also had to do with the the way that the ruler ruled on other aspects. Like, is it only for like power for political gain, for economic gain, or is it purely to keep their culture, their society safe?
Kind of going off of that as well. I think that is part of what I want to say, but what really caught my attention while reading the book is just the pragmatism of the Mexica and their worldview. They were very much see it how it is and play it smart, essentially.
Yeah.
So like one of the things that I was thinking is like lots of the major world religions today are very idealistic, and so they always like go for like the best possible version, versus the Mexica, and part of their religion, but mostly just like their day-to-day worldview was recognized the brutality and like pain of life of the world that they lived in, and they accepted it and then used it, if that makes sense. And one of the kind of examples that caught my attention was on page 73. Oh, 77. There it is. Yeah, page 77. It talks about what women were taught, and it says that every girl learned the proper prayers for a marriage ceremony and for daily life. She learned to spin and weave and embroider. She also learned her duties as a future wife and mother. She discovered, for instance, that she would have very little sleep for much of her adult life, and that she must not resent it. Which is interesting. You know, they were saying it's tough, but deal with it, be strong. And then it goes on to talk about how the men were taught to fight, because if they didn't, then they would fall from power. You know, and so it wasn't like this, we're the best, we can now sit and enjoy our fruits. It was like, we have to always be on guard. We have to always be the best so that we don't get overpowered.
Yeah, and if you, page 79, it talks about what happens if you disobey the laws, if you use poor judgment, if you basically do something foolish, um, they're going to make a public example of you, and they're going to make sure that other people see you and know, okay, I don't do that. I shouldn't act that way. And it discusses, you know, mothers taking their daughters out to watch these um, these public examples of other women not accepting that this is adulthood, this is what you need to do. um, so I just found that interesting, to see how the Meshikas seem to be very um, in tune with lessons and um, trying to educate the younger generation, so that they would have the best chance as adults.
I think it's kind of in the same chapter. So it's on page 80. I thought it was interesting. She inserted the like the poem song in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of feels like it serves that same purpose of like how the women, it says, um, the heart of the woman taken from the land of her birth to serve others until her death. And then she basically, reads the poem as the poem. And I think that's really interesting because when you really think about it, women, they were enslaved essentially, right? And they were taken from their place of home and not knowing anything and not being able to really survive without the men, and they were told what to do. And I think the author putting in that poem and really helps with a better understanding what the actually women were going through when they were enslaved and not ones that were of privilege. And I thought that was interesting.
So I was trying to find that book. Okay. I also, just to build off that a little bit, I really thought, like, you made a good point about the lessons, like teaching through example, teaching through lesson, making an example out of someone. I really thought, like, when reading that the first time, it kind of fell back in. I fell back like everything into place, like just thinking about their strong views and values that make up their society, and know like that as we go deeper into the book, all of those just start to fall into place and start to just allow us to build a stronger connection to like specifically this poem and understanding at that time how that really fit in to the to the timeline. Um, and I also thought that that was a big part for me out of that chapter. Just kind of trying to debunk it in my own way. Because I think that a lot of the time, reading it, as a story, it's different when you're trying to imagine it at that time specifically. And I thought it was really important.
Do we want to move on to? We only have about 15 minutes, is what it looks like. So we want to move on to chapter 4.
Yeah.
I guess kind of one thing that shocked me. Again, going back to what I learned growing up, you learn that the Spanish conquered the Aztecs because they had superior weapons and technology and because of disease. But it was kind of eye-opening, I guess, to read like the real difference in technology, because like the stone tools, not necessarily of the Mexica, but of the other peoples and empires around them that the Spanish interacted with. Like they would lead attacks against the Spanish and they would just get decimated. I mean, like hundreds of casualties on the native side versus like 5 on the Spanish side. And so it was just kind of eye-opening to realize really how big that difference in technology was. The stone tools just shattered against metal.
I know for me, like the whole like learning more about Cortez was really eye-opening. And like you said, like the Spanish were more powerful and had the ability to fight longer if they needed to against the tribes. And so learning more about the Cortez and Spanish and what they did, I found, especially in this chapter, I think it was interesting because you don't know how bad it really was. Because you can't really, I mean, obsidian against metal, it's night and day. And so I feel like that's the tribes knew they could, I mean, maybe, I don't know, but like they were going up against a really strong power. And I feel like, I wonder if they knew that it was going to be all for nothing almost. So.
Well, I think one of the problems is, for the Mexica, they're treating the Spaniards like they're enemies that they're used to facing, and it's not the same. And, the tactics that they would use with, their usual enemies just don't work. But also, with the Mexica at this point, they are the most powerful in the region, So I think they, you have that mix of not really knowing what they're up against, but also maybe just kind of overestimating themselves. They've been in a place of power for that long, and when you've had that much power for that long, you start to, get a bit cocky. You start to, you start to feel invincible.
Yeah, I would definitely say it was a blind war. It was more just no, not just not estimating the threat at all. Like kind of just going off of kind of what chapter 4, like this perspective on Aztec society was obviously lesser. It was obviously already just, just another easy invasion, another easy piece of the puzzle that they need to accomplish to get to where they want. except at the end of the day, it ultimately wasn't like that, and they really went in head on into the unknown because they overestimated themselves and the power of the Aztec society just in a lot of different ways. I think you know um, the power gain just it makes rulers. I feel like in as many examples of the book just kind of think that they're gonna go in and just win everything every time, gain everything that they want, and that was an important part to me, just kind of seeing that the perspective on a society that you don't know really anything about really affects the way that the outcome's going to happen and what's going to come from that. And even now, us, discussing that, it just shows like um, the advances in each society was clear, but no one would know that then, and no one could have predicted that either. Um, so I really thought that that was an important part.
Well, and I think as well that as terrible a person as he was, it is important to recognize just Cortes was also just really smart. He was really intelligent and had a really good strategic mind. And he knew, I mean, in page 100, it mentions that he left the Caribbean without permission of the governor. And so he knew that if he didn't win, that was it for him. There was, if not outright executed, he would get, shamed or exiled from Spain. And so he had that drive, obviously, aside from personal, glory, but he also knew that he had to win. But then he was also really intelligent. He knew that his small number, even in how advanced their technology was, that wouldn't be able to take an entire city, and so they forcefully recruited the other villages and kingdoms and stuff so that they could take the city, and they kind of forced the way into a meeting. I can't remember what page, but it talks about how they didn't want to meet with Cortez, and then he went and conquered a couple of villages and then marched all the way to Tenochtitlan and forced a meeting between him and Moctezuma, or Moctezuma was.
Yeah, Moctezuma.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, um, chapter 4, it mentions Doña Marina, um, and her role in everything that happens. Um, and I think that while the Mexica probably knew that they had, I mean, well, actually, obviously, they knew they had enemies and they had, you know, people that would love to see them fall. Um, I don't think that they could have really anticipated, um, their enemies working with these um, strangers.
And it just shows also the intelligence of Malinche. She knew that, as a slave, this was her way out, essentially. And she obviously had to go through some terrible stuff. She was married to the something Aguilar,
Mm-hmm.
like that duke, and then she also hopped in, or she also started a relationship with Cortez, and so she was again very intelligent, very strategic, because she realized that this was her way out of slavery, and this is her opportunity to survive, if not advance herself out of just servitude.
I thought like in chapter, I think it's chapter 6. Yeah, chapter 6, how they described how Cortez was giving gifts out to the people who followed him. I thought that was kind of interesting because why do you need to give gifts to your followers? Like, what was the purpose of that? Why, if they believed in you and believed in what you're saying, why were you needing to shower them gifts? And that, I don't know, I just thought that was interesting, and how it said that he also didn't receive permission to give those gifts out. So yeah.
But just so we're aware, I don't know if you saw, but the call will end automatically in about 12 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So considering we don't have that much time left, was there anything that, the reflection questions, one of them is, was there anything that made you sad or was upsetting, like what kind of emotions were you guys feeling while reading this?
I thought I just found it not like really emotions or anything, just becoming more aware of the situation, I think. And how one in my notes I put for myself was, I thought it was interesting because of how the different tribes treated women differently, but not all of them treated them the same, that they were seen differently by different tribes. And I thought that was interesting. And so for me, I think that would be my what I took out of it. So yeah, that would be mine.
Yeah. For me, it just gave me a bigger perspective of everything. Um, I wouldn't say it made me like sad or mad. I think it more just gave me uh it the acknowledgement of everything in a way that, you know, it gives it in a timeline with different examples and different aspects of the story, and it really was eye-opening for me, and it makes me appreciate, the everything that goes into it because I mean, it'll obviously help me in the future, just understanding it better, but also just in context of, you know, trying to not teach things to yourself, but like understand them for yourself. And so I was more like glad that I got that out of it. So yeah.
Yeah. Same. I'm just glad. I mean, the author, I think, did an incredible job of writing it. Like, I actually enjoyed reading the book. I think she did a really good job of kind of writing it almost like a narrative, um, which was great. And same, I appreciate the kind of deeper understanding of the Mexica, just because they teach you that they were there, they sacrificed people, the Spanish came and conquered them essentially, and and that's just so surface level it hurts. And so I appreciate kind of that deeper understanding. And one thing that did kind of I don't know if it made me sad, but thinking if I were in that position, it would be pretty emotional. But just like the sheer number of human sacrifices on the latter end of the Aztec Empire, it mentions that originally it was more for special religious events or holidays. And then as they grew in power, it became more and more common. And then by the time that the Spanish came, the Mexica were pretty regularly sacrificing large numbers of people. And so that was something new to me, I guess, is just the sheer number.
Yeah, well, and just um, page 49 talks about how victims of sacrifice, they were trying to not show emotions when they were going through that kind of that was probably one of the things the book talked about that um, stood out to me more emotionally. Just to think about you're about to be sacrificed. You've already been captured and um, you know, enslaved, and here you are still expected to bring honor to your people and not show your fear. Like that would just be an incredibly difficult thing to do and try to maintain when you're in a state like that.
Yeah, kind of almost, not almost, I think it is kind of admirable, just the stoicism that not just the Mexica society had, but the entire kind of like ethno-linguistic group that were the Nahua. Like they all had that idea of being stoic, of being courageous in like these moments. And then the example of shield flower as well is kind of the idea that's given there. So
And you can tell that, that had a huge, that fear of the Mexica had a huge impact on people because, it mentions page 64, the quote, in the forest lands, if one suddenly heard the mewling or scream of a flesh eating animal, some people feared it meant that one would soon be taken prisoner and enslaved or killed, or that one's children would become prisoners. Like, that's just crazy to think, just always be in fear. And to be in fear of not just yourself, but also your children. And, we know from these civilizations that they valued their children because they were the future generation.
Was there anything of the book that you didn't like?
I would say there's not really anything specific that I didn't like. I think part of it is just that that one's kind of hard because I feel like it was everything was laid out in a great way, and I just think that some of it was like possibly could have gone into even more detail because
Mhm.
there was a lot that and a lot of context to every part of it, but I do think like learning more about women and their roles and rulers and different rulers how you know their roles differed like specific connections. I mean there was quite a few specific connections, but I think like going into that further probably would have helped the story a little more just
Mhm.
in relating things back to each other, being able to make a clear decision about different rulers and not so much like combining them into one whole group. Um, so I think if anything, it would be that, but I wouldn't say there wasn't anything that I didn't like that was already in there.
Mm-hmm.
agreed.
That would be
Yeah.
mine too, actually. The whole like going more into depth of more with like the women and their struggles more and the different tribes, I think would have helped a little bit more. But I think she did it overall. Like Jesse, is it Jesse, right?
Mhm.
What you said, she did a really good job in describing things for us. And so yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just 320 pages is very digestible, and I think that's what she was aiming for. And if she would have, but obviously, I imagine she wanted to include more, but if she were to include everything she wanted, it would be like 1,000-page book. So I imagine it has to do with a little bit of just her trying to figure out what is most important for her to put in or what she wants the reader to learn versus just like not doing it, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, and all in all, you don't often see things written from the perspectives and the accounts of, um, the Mexica. Typically, it's the perspective of someone like Cortez or, some other explorer, um, or, current historians, their interpretations of things. So it's kind of nice to see something that is told um, primarily from the perspective of the Mexica.
We only have like 2 minutes left now, but
Okay.
one more thing that it was sad and kind of funny at the same time was just it mentions that the Spanish taught the Mexica people how to read and write in like the Latin alphabet, and they immediately started writing their own history, which like pissed off the Spanish priests.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad just because that they had to do that. They were like, we're gonna lose all this, and so we have to record it. But it was also just kind of funny. Like they were like, here, use this to write about all these good Christian civilized things, and then they were like, well, we're just gonna write our own history. So
Yeah.
Agreed.
Right.
If there's nothing else, does anyone have any like last comments or I don't know, anything that was like wrong? Like, are you guys gonna be good for the reflections? I know I'm like pretty set.
It should be fine. Yeah.
thank you guys.
Yes. And
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll work on posting the video right now.
Thank you,
It's nice to
Olivia.
meet you guys.
Nice to
Nice
meet
to
you
meet you
guys.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.